Perfect. So good afternoon. Welcome to the Trees and Design Action Group meeting. TDAG is a network and a forum that brings people and organisations together to support the role of urban trees through better collaboration in the planning, design, construction, management and maintenance of our urban areas. Evidence-based information and sharing best practice is really important to us, and we have three brilliant presentations today from people who are working in the urban forestry sector. We're also partnering with the RTPI, and I'd like to thank them for encouraging their members to attend to us today. But without any further ado, I would like to pass over to Alan Simpson. Alan is Professor Emeritus and Tree Great. He's got a background in landscape architecture and has taught many students at Leeds Beckett over the years. He's also worked really constructively with local authorities and organisations to get trees planted in the urban realm. So, Alan, over to you.
Blimey, follow that. Thank you, Emma, and humble apologies to everyone for being late. I'm not quite sure why the technology didn't work, but for whatever reason, it didn't. But we're going now. So very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, to all of you here in Europe. Good morning to you if you're over on the other side of the pond in Canada or the States. And a very good evening, of course, if you're on the other side of the planet in Hong Kong or in a similar location. So a very warm welcome to this TDAG seminar on why we should plant a tree. Much work has been done over recent years to prove the environmental, social and economic benefits of having healthy trees in our urban areas. And thus this urban forest is a critically multifunctional infrastructure which contributes much towards tackling many of the issues and problems that we now face in our towns and cities, such as mitigating carbon emissions, contributing to climate resilience and adaptation, restoring natural capital and increasing biodiversity, enabling and facilitating active travel, and promoting our physical and mental well-being. So that is an amazing range of benefits that our urban trees provide. As a result, urban tree planting has in recent years been ramping up the social and political agendas. And this has made a very significant change, I think, to how trees are now considered. They are no longer seen as a cosmetic, a green something just to add to our urban areas after other developments have taken place. Trees are now a metaphysic, a first principle. Because if we don't get the urban forest right, the other aspects of our viable urban futures will not be successful. Thus, this has changed how we consider the planning, the design, implementation, and the prospective management of our urban trees. As a result, trees are increasingly becoming embedded in many national and local policies and strategies. For example, the England Trees Action Plan, the Re-Tree Fit campaign of the RTPI, the revisions to the National Planning Policy Framework, as well as local authority master plans. Some of the issues associated with such a master plan is the focus of our second talk this afternoon. Just before Christmas, a report was published here that suggested that freestanding trees, i.e. trees not in woodlands, contribute some £3.9 billion annually to the UK economy. And a recent article in the medical journal, The Lancet, confirmed that urban trees have a very significant role to play in improving and maintaining the health and well-being of our urban populations. Significant contributions, I think, to our knowledge. Much of the progress that urban forestry has benefited from has been as a result of better communications between those who know the benefits of planting trees in our towns and those who accept that. An excellent example of this will be discussed by our first speaker, Professor Cecil Condonadike, who will be presenting his concept of 3-30-300 and how this gets applied in practice. Many of you will know Cecil's name, even if you haven't come paths crossed as yet. Cecil has a wealth of experience, having studied, taught, published and advised on aspects of urban forestry and nature-based solutions internationally for over 25 years, and is widely considered to be one of the world's leading urban forestry experts. His work has been featured by many leading media outlets. He helped found the leading academic journal Urban Forestry and Urban Greening, and is currently editor-in-chief of the ISA's scientific journal Arboriculture and Urban Forestry. He has advised many international, national, and local organizations in over 30 countries. And I think I can let you know that he has recently been listed as a nominee to be the Dutch Green Influencer of 2022. Wow, brilliant. Cecil, a very warm welcome to you, and the stage is yours, sir.
Thank you so much, Alan, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to TDAG for hosting a webinar on such an important topic. Why plant a tree? Well, I guess for many of us, the answer seems to be obvious, but as we also know, this is not always the case. So I'm really happy to share with you some of the work I've been doing in terms of communication, in terms of providing some planning guidance, not only to us green people, but especially also to the affiliated professions, planners, architects, to politicians, but actually also to local residents, because there is something about the formula of 330-300 that seems to appeal to people, as I will mention during this brief talk. So what is happening with, with 330-300? Well, the idea, first of all, and I'm not going to give you a very deep introduction in this, is that we really want to bring trees and green spaces close to where people live. And the idea is then to really, first of all, give people access to visible green. So that's the 3 larger trees, so well-established trees that everybody should see from their window, be it from your home, from your work or place of learning. Then we also would like to see at least 30% canopy cover in every neighborhood. So this is not a citywide average. This is really for every neighborhood to strive for 30%. And then the next one is to have no more than 300 meters to a high quality urban green space, public green space that people can use for recreation, for meeting other people, etc. And I'll show you a little bit of the evidence behind this. There's quite a lot of research on the distance side of things. So if you have about a 5-minute, maybe 10-minute walk, you're much more inclined to use your local green space regularly. And this is also then found to be promoting your health and your well-being. The 30% canopy is also increasingly connected to health benefits, mental health, physical health, but also cooling issues. And I'll give you an example of a recent study on that in a bit. And of course, the 3 trees is maybe the most subjective element, but it's really a proxy for us to make sure that we have good visual access to nature. And for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we really, of course, realized how important it is to have that closeness and visibility of nature where we live and work. So yeah, so this is a bit of the background, and it became a bit of a runaway success. I launched this rule of thumb, guideline, whatever you want to call it, communication tool, about 2 years ago, almost to the day, 2 years ago. And within a few weeks, it was picked up by major media. There was a lot of buzz and talk about this in the architecture and planning world, and as well amongst politicians. And I'll give you a few examples of that. And even the World Economic Forum picked it up last year and made a little movie about this new rule that could drive greener cities forward. So this is just some of the examples of people who have taken it up, organizations that have taken it up. So all the way from the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, the Nordic Council of Ministers has provided guidance on 330-300, but also Greenpeace and Nature Canada, and a whole range of municipalities across the world have used it in some way, have formally adopted. I have a little bit lost track, I would say, but already in a country like the Netherlands, at least 20 or 25 municipalities are working with it today. So my guess is that there are hundreds of cities across the world now that are already implementing it in some way. And this is also interestingly picked up by political parties. And I'll give you a few examples of that are really using this to promote the importance of nearby nature and nearby trees to people in their party programs. So yeah, the UNECE, the United Nations, I wrote a policy document for them last year. And one of the things that they really focus on is actually to make sure that we bring the benefits of trees and of green spaces to everybody. And they see 330-300 as a really excellent way to do it. It's something that is easy to remember, obviously. Everybody can remember the 330-300 part of it. But it also makes a lot of sense in terms of visibility, dwelling amongst green, as well as accessing green and using green nearby. The guidance that we developed for the Nordic Council of Ministers also talks about 330-300 and advises Nordic cities to use this as part of a suite of principles that they can use for greening. We talk about things like equity. We talk about things like offering a diverse range of green experiences. We talk about connectivity, and we also talk about visibility, again, proximity of green spaces. And here the 330-300 rule comes in pretty nicely. So just one example, this is the city of Haarlem, close to Amsterdam in the Netherlands, where one of the political parties, the Green Party in Haarlem, made an amendment or proposed an amendment to the green policy of the city, saying that we should really use 330-300 as a monitoring tool, as an ambition for the city, even though Haarlem is pretty dense and very concretized, very urbanized. And then they actually made their own little adaptation. They say, well, for the 30% trees is maybe very difficult. So we will go initially for 30% green space, public green space cover in every neighborhood. And this has now been adopted in the policy document for green in Haarlem. Yeah, I said politicians have really liked this idea of 330-300. It's easy to remember. It's easy to communicate. One of the mayoral candidates in Toronto, Gil Penalosa, used it as part of his green agenda when he was running for mayor last year. He didn't win, but he became number 2 after the incumbent mayor, and he scored more than 25% of the vote, which was pretty amazing. And he really said he was going to implement 330-300 Toronto-wide. In Sweden, there was a national election where 3 of the national parties used 330-300 as part of their environmental agenda. All 3 lost, unfortunately, but I kind of hope it was not because of the 330-300 part of the program. And then the other day, I found out that Zimbabwe, as a country, has a strategy for urban greening and urban afforestation, and also refers to planting trees in urban areas is generally governed by the 330-300 rule. So yeah, this is already starting to live a little bit of a life of its own, which of course comes also at the requirement to be really careful. It's a quantitative target. It has some qualitative element in it, but of course this needs to be carefully combined with things like principles, quality considerations, urban tree diversity considerations, and so forth. So it's really part of a wider agenda of greening cities. Some of you may have seen Scotland, Future Woodland Scotland, which is a not-for-profit that has traditionally worked mostly in rural areas of Scotland, but is now also doing urban work. And they are starting a program now of greening Scottish cities according to the 330-300 principle, and are actually recruiting a new urban forester for this, and also have a substantial amount of funding available to drive this program. Some cities have been kind of a little bit ahead of the stream and actually now kind of retroactively implementing 330-300. And one of them is Barcelona, the city where I lived for the last 2.5 years. So their idea here is to create super blocks. So they close off 3x3 city blocks in the exemplar area of the city. And within that, they're planting trees and making more public spaces available. This is how it looks in the street where I used to live. So you see, this is really happening. Car habitat, car space is being turned into public space and tree space. And one of the ambitions the city has is exactly to have a 30% canopy cover. Of course, there's always the question, I often get this, well, 330-300 is wonderful, but how do we do this in practice? Well, there's of course all kinds of interesting things happening. The tiny forest, or the Miyawaki forest, or the wonder woudjes, as they call in Belgium, all kinds of ways of calling this. Small tennis court size little woodlands that are being implemented across the UK and elsewhere. Green on buildings, like here the Wonderwoods in Utrecht, of course Bosque Vertical and so other examples. There's all kind of new things happening, parklets, pocket parks, that actually make it possible to bring trees into public spaces. And of course here also private spaces, private gardens are a really important component. If we want to reach 30% canopy cover, we'll definitely have to mobilize private land as well. Another question I often get, of course, is how do we measure this? It's not so difficult these days to measure canopy cover, so that is a pretty straightforward operation. 300 meters distance, and this is not as the crow flies, but this is the actual walking distance or cycling distance to your nearest park. And then, of course, the 3 trees, the visibility issue is a little bit more tricky, but there are ways to map this using GIS proxy approaches, or maybe even things like Google Street View and so. And one example is Cobra Groen Inzicht in the Netherlands, is a green care company here, and they have done 330-300 assessment for all cities in the Netherlands. And this is the example of Utrecht. I just need to mute myself, I realized, because everybody was muted. All right, so this is for Utrecht, 300 meters distance. You see here the historical center of the city. Here, a lot of people don't have easy access to public green space, but you see as soon as you go out in the rings around it, it's pretty good. When you go to the more, let's say, socially challenged areas of the city, you see that often the access to green space is not as good. So often you see this unequal, unfair distribution of green space that we also know from many UK cities. So these kind of tools, of course, these kind of maps, according to 330-300, are really a useful tool for planning, for decision making, to really find out, well, where are the weak spots? Where do we have the quality? Where do we have the canopy cover? Where are we going to see problems, for example, during heat events in cities? And here in Utrecht, of course, there are obviously some areas that will be more vulnerable during extreme heat. The region of Scania in southern Sweden was the first region, as far as I know, worldwide, that did a regional assessment of 330-300. And they actually developed their own tool, which should be published pretty soon. And they did an assessment of all the municipalities in Scania, because they want to start using this as a policy directive, basically, for greening in the cities. I think where really things start happening is also when it becomes a citizen science approach. Just people asking, journalists asking, how many trees can you see from your window? Engaging people in understanding what does it mean to have 30% canopy cover? How far do you have to walk to your nearest public green space? And here I get a lot of responses from people that work at the neighborhood level, in local not-for-profits. I want to develop, for example, cooling centers. There was a group in Voorst, in the Brussels area in Belgium, for example, that started proposing a 330-300 strategy to the municipality to make sure that there were cool spots and cool neighborhoods where trees, of course, play a really important role. Well, of course, the question then is, well, is there really enough evidence to support this? And I based the 330-300 rule off evidence that was existing, especially strong on the 30% and the 300-meter side. Recently, there have been two studies that are really strengthening the case for 330-300. One study done in Barcelona by a team at IS Global, which is a public health institute. They did a study for those places that actually meet 330-300 in Barcelona, and found that the places actually fully meet it had better mental health. People living there had better mental health aspects. They use less medication, and so it was a pretty strong evidence on this. And then very interesting recently, another study by the same organization, but this for I think 50+ cities in Europe, showed that reaching a 30% canopy cover in your neighborhood reduces the risk of premature death because of heat events, urban heat islands, with 1/3, which is actually pretty dramatic. So 1/3 less excess deaths during heat waves if you can reach 30% canopy cover, which is, I think, very powerful. A little piece of research that we haven't published yet. This is in southern Florida, or in the Tampa area, where we did a survey. First of all, showing people what does it look like to have 30% canopy cover, or 20 or 40, and ask people, well, what is the canopy cover in your neighborhood? And you see here that a lot of people in Florida actually have 30% or even more canopy, according to their own impression, but still a lot of people asking for more trees. So they say at least the current amount, or maybe more trees would be great. And also we asked them the question, well, if you look out of your window, how many trees can you see? And by far, most people in Florida could see at least 3 trees. And this is a representative sample of this part of Florida as well. So interesting to see, of course, that a lot of people are in conditions where they see trees, but we did a similar study in Spain, also a sample of about 2,000 people, and that showed that about 30% of those we interviewed did not see even more than 1 tree in their local neighborhood. So with 330-300 so far, I think it's now really moving into the implementation phase. It's still early days to see the direct effect of it, and I think it will be really interesting to monitor this, and there are some studies on the way. But I think it's really starting to move from policy to implementation, and it's also really, I think, offering inspiration to greening programs. It does allow for monitoring, so we have much more refined ways now to measure it. We're actually working on a new paper where we're going to align all of these methods available to assess the 30, and the 300 components. Of course, it needs to be combined with other guidelines and principles. It can never be a standalone target, ticking the boxes 330-300 and we're home. It should always be part of a much more nuanced, of course, greening strategy. It does help, I think, to take trees and green space more serious. That is what I really find in my interactions with decision makers, with politicians. And there's much more talk now about trees as critical infrastructure, for example, during climate change events. The evidence base for especially 30 and 300 is very strong. And I think by bringing the trees in, there's more and more focus now also on the importance of visible green space. Of course, we have to adapt to local context. It will make a difference if you're working in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, as compared to Charleston in the US, where they have almost 60% canopy cover, obviously. And I think one interesting trend that we see in the Netherlands now is there's a push towards securing tree space in terms of the land use plan, in terms of the legal status of spaces for trees, because often the problem is that these spaces are not protected. So when trees disappear or are felled, it's often very easy to take up these tree spaces. So is it a possibility to maybe start building in and legally securing tree spaces, and maybe also work rather with canopy, with crown volume as a proxy for ecosystem services, and then you could actually steer your urban forestry program towards maintaining crown volume or expanding crown volume over time. And then finally, and I think Simon is going to talk about this also really gives some good tools, some good handles to work on in urban forest master planning, where you can really start developing some critical key performance indicators to monitor your progress in terms of urban forestry. So I think with that, Alan, I will pass it back to you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Better to unmute first. Thank you. Wonderful, Cecil, for a very stimulating presentation indeed. And there are a few questions and comments. Suzanne Simmons, for example, is wondering if we are setting our targets far too low in the UK, in our cities, if the optimum is suggested by Cecil to be 30%. I don't know what your view on that, Cecil, is. I think probably is yes.
I would say so, yes. So definitely, that's also why 330-300 are set as minimum, right? So there are cities in the US that are far exceeding this. There are even cities in Europe and in the Netherlands that are exceeding this. So of course, we don't want cities to lower their expectations or their ambitions. So it's really something that should be a step in the process. On the other hand, cities that are far below some of these targets, of course, they don't want to be discouraged in moving towards it. So it's really a long-term perspective in many cases to have something to really start striving for and step-by-step improve, maybe working on new neighborhoods first, and then slowly take better care of the urban forest as well over time.
Yes, excellent. Question from Giovanni Pagano. How do you take into account the accessibility and safety of these areas in relation to the 330-300?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it is defined for the 300 meters as high quality public green space. Of course, their safety is a very important consideration. Multifunctionality, obviously, as well. But also when it comes to things like too much darkness and shade in neighborhoods, we have had some discussion about it, but 30% is generally seen as doable while still having enough light coming into neighborhoods. So finding a good balance, that's why we don't maybe want to go to 50% canopy cover, but finding a good balance between the shading effects and maybe some of the more negative effects of that as well.
Yes, excellent. Question from Sue. How did Barcelona manage the conflict with car owners and the loss of car space for green space, or was it not a problem there, like it probably would be here, I suspect?
It was quite a problem, Sue, I can tell you. This has been a process of many, many years. And I think what happened is during COVID, when they closed off streets, what they said temporarily, so they painted them yellow and said, this is now public space, that actually helped adapt people or adopt it and accept it. So I think now it's much more doable. There's still a lot of debate. There's still some discussion that if the current government in Barcelona would not win the next election, which could be happening, that the whole program could actually be on hold. But I would say in general, more and more people are accepting this. I think there's some pushback from local residents in some cases and some business owners. But then other business owners also see there's actually a benefit in having treed terraces and green spaces around their business that actually would probably draw in more customers.
Excellent. I think that answers probably a question from Emma, which was what do people in Barcelona think of such a big change to their urban realm? And I think we probably know. Okay, I'm just looking to see if there are any. Yes. Hans, what's your definition for green space concerning the 300-meter walking distance? Is there a minimum size?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a lot of debate. WHO, the World Health Organization, which recommends 300 meters to a green space, talks about 1 hectare. This could be in some cases, I think, maybe be too large. So I've been sometimes saying in the range of 0.5 hectares at least. But then there should be also a mix of uses possible. So not just a little field of grass, right? It should be really something with vegetation, open space, offering some different opportunities and opportunities for experiences. But this is really one that has been a bit of a headache for the GIS people to define what is included, what is not included. But I hope that we can move forward towards being clear about what quality in this case and what green space means.
Yeah, thank you for that. Another question from Sue. Is there a link between geography, climate, and appropriate canopy cover percentages?
Yes, I would say so. And I think there's more and more work coming out now that actually starts looking at things like configurations, at looking at places where, of course, when you have more topography, like in Barcelona, trees will have a different impact as well. And for example, one of the things you see there is that the visibility of trees will increase, right? If you have a topography in your city. So I think here, we really need to work very closely with the designers, the landscape designers, to make sure we optimize. That's why when people say like 3 trees visible for everybody is impossible, I know it's doable. I've seen it in Frederiksberg in Denmark, where they have a policy of 1 tree for everybody visible, and they've had it for a few years, and they easily realize that within a short period of time. So I think it is a lot of clever design that needs to go into this as well.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. There are quite a few questions asking if there are any guides to implementing 330, 300 or the information. So I think some of that will be put on the chat anyway. And obviously it will be available afterwards, after the conclusion or a week or 2 after the conclusion of this seminar.
Alan,
yes.
Can I just interrupt? There's one interesting question from Neil Bancroft, because it's our age-old problem about maintenance. You know, if we have more green and more things, we're just going to get more kind of pushback that, you know, this is going to need far too much maintenance and we can't do it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think one part of the discussion is definitely to shift the focus away from planting to maintenance. There's some interesting work in the Netherlands now where companies that are involved in tree planting are actually also involved in maintenance for the next 10, 20 years. So actually you get much more integrated approaches, and the approach starts being plant less trees, but manage those trees better and let them grow older. So I think, again, there we should really be clever about how we design programs so we don't overload green space management departments, and also involve other actors like private landowners, garden owners in building that canopy as well. So I fully agree. I think this is a very important point that we should be careful not to overpromise.
Yes, I think that's very true. And I think we also have to convince our political colleagues that management is the tool by which design never ends. And we are constantly redesigning our towns and cities, and clearly management is a key part of that. So yes, Tim, you're right. Quality, not quantity of new tree planting, perhaps. Okay, well, thank you, Cecil, for a very stimulating presentation and a very excellent start to our seminar here. So thank you for that. There will be at the end, ladies and gentlemen, a chance for more debate and questions. But I think probably now we can move on to our second speaker. And our second speaker is Simon Needle. He is a member of the City of Birmingham City Design and Conservation team and is a very busy fellow. He's the city's principal ecologist on Mondays and Fridays, and their principal arborist on Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday. So a very talented gentleman indeed. Birmingham have drawn up an urban forestry master plan, and Simon's presentation will consider how the urban forestry master plan is addressing tree inequalities in the city. Sir, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just try and pop my screen up. It might take a second just to share. So as soon as it's up there, if somebody can let me know they can see it. I'm also going to pop my video off as well because it's my laptop's a bit slow and cranky.
I can see it, Simon.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so yes, thanks Alan for that introduction. And yes, although it does say Mondays and Fridays and Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Actually, everything interlinks so much that actually it's just all of everything all of the time, and more as well, which is always the way when you work for a local authority. You always seem to inherit lots of other duties and tasks to go on with this. So yes, so yeah, thanks to TDAG for asking me to present on this front, and this will hopefully tie into a little bit of what Cecil was talking about. And we did actually work with Cecil and Kenton from Tree Economics on the development of our urban forest master plan. So hopefully we can show some synergy going on here. So yeah, as let me see if I can get these actually slides to progress as well, which always helps. There we go. So I think just set the picture really for those people who don't know Birmingham really well, or come to Birmingham and go into the city centre. For many people, the city looks like this: very dense urban development, lots of high-rise buildings going up, a huge amount of regeneration going on within the city centre, but not looking particularly green. However, we also have areas that are just probably a mile from the city centre that look like this. So that sort of 330-300 rule is definitely met out there. I think certainly in terms of the 3 and the 30% canopy cover. And this is Edgbaston, which is one of our sort of leafy suburbs. I think we're all aware of the sorts of impacts that we're facing, the challenges that we're facing. And for Birmingham, we're no different to many other cities around the world. We've got a population of 1.1 million and rising. We're one of the youngest populations in Europe. The city's divided into 69 wards, of which a high percentage of those are in the top 10 percentile for multiple deprivation. We have high levels of years life lost in certain quarters, through to numerous factors that could be through to air pollution, urban heat island, poor nutrition, lack of financial income to support better dietary requirements. And we also have areas that are suffering from pluvial and fluvial flooding, and we've also got a high demand for housing with this growing population that we have. And we have a higher demand for housing than we actually have a land supply of for the coming years as well. So it's a particularly difficult issue. I think I noticed in some of the comments that were popping up there about talking about the learning that we've had from COVID-19 pandemic, and of course that did bring to the fore that inequity of accessible green space and quality green space as well, where you do have some green space available, it's not always of a high quality. And it seems as though those ethnic minority communities within Birmingham were significantly more impacted by the pandemic, and also they are impacted by those poor air quality areas and high urban heat island areas. And liaison with other departments such as public health in Birmingham are critical for us to understand those impacts and the benefits that green infrastructure can bring. Obviously, those are our sort of challenges, but we also have those global challenges as well, which I think we've all seen, or probably most of us have seen this slide, these big impending challenges that are coming forward, whether we've had COVID-19, but we're looking at climate change and biodiversity collapse as well if we're not acting on the science that we're seeing today. So we know these things are coming ahead, but how can we be best trying to, I suppose, build resilience within the city? So again, this is obviously a topic that's been covered a lot elsewhere in other disciplines as well, about how we make adapted cities, whether that be at a neighbourhood level or whether that be on a street level, looking at how we integrate green infrastructure for air quality, mitigating heat stress, noise reduction, it improves physical activity, all those other things that we see on a regular basis. So this is helping guide, I suppose, our development in the city. We're looking at how we best integrate this into our new planning policies, how we stipulate the amount of green space, the accessibility of green space, the proximity, etc. So it's all feeding in. This was also, I suppose, taken into account when we were looking at our urban forest master plan for Birmingham as well. So we've had a number of tree policies and processes in place for a number of years now. But we actually needed something with a much longer term overarching vision. And so we jointly with our local tree warden group, Birmingham Tree People, and Cecil's and Tree Economics were co-wrote the Urban Forest Master Plan for Birmingham from 2021 to 2051. So this was looking at, I suppose, this adaptive management process. What do we have? What do we want? How do we get there? But most importantly, I think this is one thing that seems to be missing from a lot of tree strategies and documents and policies and stuff, is about how we are doing. How do we monitor what our influences, or how we're sort of working towards that that overall long-term vision. And within our urban forest master plan, we've started with these criteria and indicators, which were taken from well-known sources, really, I suppose. But we looked at those, looked at how they apply to the city. We added a few extra, not that there's not enough there already, but we did add a few of our own into that process to make it more tailored for the city itself. Out of that, we arrived with, I suppose this is a bit of an at a glance key performance indicator table. We looked at our performance against those key performance indicators and determined whether we were performing low, moderate, good, or optimal in terms of quality and standard against each of those. Some of those we found that we were doing quite well against, not optimal on any of those at this point. Some of them moderate, and some of them were actually low, and that there was reasons behind why some of those were low, and it was mainly because we didn't necessarily have some of the data sets around those, and that's something that we've been addressing over the years or so since we formed the urban forest plan. One of our key targets in there, and I suppose this ties into a bit that earlier conversation, was around environmental justice, cultural values, and equity. And this was looking at, again, the city as a whole, looking at it on a ward basis, looking at those indices of multiple deprivation, and then looking at what things like were the access to green space, access, how easy was it to access the green space, what was the size of the green space, what was the level of trees, the percentage canopy cover, or the access to trees that they had within those areas. And so one of the things we were looking to do there was develop and monitor specific tools for assessing fair access to all, produce a tree equity map, and ensure that new tree planting is linked to local need and involves local communities. And although the map in this picture here is at ward level, we've actually gone down to lower super output areas. So we've gone from 69 wards down to 639 lower super output areas. So it's quite a lot to sort of get your head around when you're trying to sort of plan where you need to be working. One of the targets that we weren't doing, we said we weren't doing well at, really, was the canopy cover assessment and goals at the time. And although we'd actually did have a number of different canopy cover assessments, they ranged in percentage, and we had no set methodology that we were going to use going forward. And I think that was the one of the learning outcomes that we came to quite early on from this was, whatever method we were going to choose, we needed to make sure that we consistently measured it against the same set of survey conditions, or however we're going to do it going forward. So we've actually chosen to use the national tree map as our process going forward, because that's obviously using aerial imagery and LiDAR data to give us some indication of urban canopy cover. But that's not the only sort of set of data that we're going to use. We are actually going to undertake an iTree eco survey as well this year, because we need some more data around some of the tree quality, especially on land that we don't own. So get that data for private land, and also tree species data as well. We're pretty good on tree species data and quality of trees in our own ownership, but that is a big chunk of sort of information, really, that we need to be planning effectively for long-term urban forest management. So we can see here, I think we're just on that target there. I don't know how well it's easy to be seen on there, but we were looking at different existing canopy covers and 2050 targets. And so, most of these, like London, Bristol, have got 30% canopy targets, Plymouth 20, Cambridge 19, Torbay 20%. And looking at where their existing canopy covers were at the moment. So London's 21%, Bristol 18, Plymouth 18, Cambridge 17, Torbay 12. I think when we looked at our own canopy cover, we were sort of coming in somewhere around an average of, I don't know, something between 16 and 20 something %, depending on how the assessment had been undertaken. So using the National Tree Map, we actually invested in with our Tree Warden group in some software to help us sort of look more closely and monitor the urban forest. And this is our national tree map now broken down into those lower super output areas. And we've got, on this basis here, I think we started somewhere around 18.6% canopy cover by total area. But when we start excluding things like water bodies, so we take out some of the larger lakes, the rivers, the canals, the sort of places that are never going to get trees planted on them at the moment, we sort of come up to a bit more around 20% canopy cover range. But that's an average across the city. But as you can probably see by the way the colouring on the map is here, we've actually got some areas in the north of the city, which are this dark green area, and those are somewhere around 50% canopy cover. We've got these sort of mid-green areas here, which are around 30%, but we've also got these very light coloured areas in the centre, which are, some of them are down as low as, I suppose, like 8-9% canopy cover, 10 and 11%. So you can see that although we could be talking about hitting a sort of an average canopy cover for a city of 30%, that doesn't provide equitable service delivery in terms of ecosystem services, and it doesn't provide equitable access to trees, especially if we've got some areas like the affluent north where there are significant amounts of trees, and these deprived areas in the centre of the city where we have very few trees. It's not equitable at all. And like I said, that service delivery is not there at all either. So also within this platform, we included a number of other data sets, and this was to sort of try and help us prioritise how and where we need to be looking at tree planting to be delivering ecosystem services benefits to the community or the residents of Birmingham at large. So within here we had areas with existing low existing tree canopy cover. We had air quality, urban heath island maps, stormwater. So we used fluvial and fluvial flooding maps, and we also broke out all of the indices of multiple deprivation. And we were able on this platform to actually give a weighting to some of those as to what sort of things we're using this, I suppose, as a way of identifying where we need to be working. So we'd put something in as a priority for us to tackle. So if we wanted to try and say looking at air quality or urban heat islands as a priority, we could weight that as a high priority. And we can also then filter down by the site suitability for what we might want to be looking at delivering. So although it's these are not necessarily areas that's suitable for trees, it's the areas most suitable for tackling the issues that we've tried to highlight. So we can bring that down to these lower super output areas. We can then look more closely at each of those and determine what the individual canopy cover is in there, looking at the amount of plantable space that's available in there and the types of planting that's going to go in. So here we go. So within that tool, we can put in some assumptions, I suppose we should call these. We can select individual lower super output areas. We can suggest that either we want to look at increasing the canopy by a percentage, or increase the canopy cover to a specific given percentage. So we may want to say we want 20% canopy cover or 30% canopy cover, or we might decide that actually as a short-term target, we want to increase the canopy by, say, 5%. We can also look at dialing in sort of average crown diameter as well. And we know that within the inner city areas, we may have to be using smaller crown trees, but we'll always try and use the largest crown trees that we can. And we can also think about things like mortality rate as well. And that gives us some indicator of the numbers of trees that we might need to be planting to tackle those issues that we're encountering there. In this tool as well, it's also linked to the iTree Ecosystem Services tool as well. So we can get some indication of that sort of carbon monetary benefit and the amount of carbon sequestered. So we can see there we've got carbon monetary benefit, carbon sequestered, and then modelled, and also the net as well, which is useful for me as a local authority employee, where I'm having to deal with elected members, and we have things like net zero targets, and what am I doing to help contribute to climate change and sequestering carbon, because they like that as a figure. I can also put in here the fact that we're tackling stormwater interception as well, or air quality, and look at the overall benefits. So this has been really useful in terms of identifying those areas and talking about the numbers of trees, and then starting to quantify the sorts of budgets that we might be looking at to enable this, or talk with sponsors if they want to sponsor tree planting within the city, and communities, engaging with communities as well. One of the things that I mentioned earlier was, this thing about creating woodlands and forests and stuff like that, within cities. And Birmingham being a very urban city, like many others, we're not. We do have a fair bit of open space, but there is a lot of pressure on that open space to provide those other recreational benefits. So when we're looking at the creation of new woodland blocks within the landscape, we need to be considering how these may relate to and compete with other ecological features such as priority habitats and grasslands, wetlands, rivers, as well as balancing that recreation and sporting needs of citizens. So this is now tying into something else that we're having to look at, which is our local nature recovery network strategy as well. So I'll come on to that in a moment. But this is just an example of part of the city here where we're thinking, okay, well, we've got this matrix here of open space. How can we integrate a little bit more tree planting in there, create access to woodland environments that people can access off those neighbouring streets, as well as how that links into the surrounding treescape. But like I was just saying, for individual, for urban areas, individual trees are key. And for us, although we get lots of approaches from companies and sponsors who want to come and plant, thousands of trees, they all want to do it in a single location. And that, like I say, presents a problem for us, whereas we actually are looking to probably plant a few trees in thousands of locations. And the benefits will be to tens of thousands of residents rather than the few residents in that local area that can easily access that new woodland feature. So using that tree equity mapping, I suppose we could call it, we can zoom right in down to the neighbourhood level. We can start to look at where the gaps are in the canopy. We can look at land ownership because we have that data available. So we can start to plot out where we can start putting in trees, start to give ourselves an indication of where we can plant. And then using the data on our existing trees within our own ownership, we can start to look at what that species composition is as well, because we're having to look at not only how do we get new trees in, but how do we make that sustainable within each of these neighbourhoods. So looking at things like that composition, how does this fit with things like the 30-20-10 rules of no more than 30% of a family, 20% of a genus, 10% of a species. So we can see where we're starting to overuse species, where we might need to say, okay, we still need to replace some of the tilia, but we'll start using a different species. We won't plant as many of those, but we will up the percentage of planting of other species of trees to give that resilience to climate change, to pests and diseases that we're starting to see come forward. This is all encompassed, I suppose, underneath our Birmingham City of Nature plan, which is our 25-year green infrastructure strategy for the city. I just throw this bit in at the end, because this is the other competing aspects and that ties so well in with urban forestry. It is looking at how these integrate, how we integrate these trees into that open space, that mix that we need to see across the city. So yeah, 103 square miles of the city, 13.5 square miles of public open space, so 5 square miles of designated woodlands in parks and open spaces. I think that equates about 1,300 and something hectares, 250 miles of rivers, brooks and streams, 35 miles of canals. And this is where we're sort of tying into our local nature recovery network strategy. So for those of you who are not involved in biodiversity and ecology, this is something that's come through from the Environment Act 2021, which is looking at this protecting 30% of the land for nature by 2030, and an onus or a mandate on cities to have a local nature recovery network that forms part of a national network of sites, and that where we're getting development, that we are encouraging or demanding, it will be biodiversity net gain. How do we integrate that into the landscape? And this is going to compete with tree planting demands as well. But this is sort of our sort of first vision of how this might start to play out in a nature recovery network. We've got core areas for habitat and expansion zones. So we will be feeding in woodland planting and tree planting into that. And I know that sort of ties in a little bit to one of the questions somebody mentioned earlier about how do we fund this? So if developers are having to fund at least 30 years worth of maintenance for new habitats, and urban trees will feature as part of that, there is one solution to how we fund new urban tree planting going on, or support new urban tree planting going forward. The other factor that we're having to, because the other thing we're having to do is look at how we enable people to, or how we encourage people to put trees into the urban environment, especially where we need them most. A lot of our really dense urban areas that are most impacted by the impacts of climate change are going to have very low biodiversity values to start off with. They're going to have very little access to green space. So how can we change our planning policies? Can we integrate the use of things like urban greening factor as a metric for developers to start to think about how they include green space in their developments? Trees will be a key part of that. And again, if they provide trees with good rooting volumes so that we've got sustainable trees for the long term that establish well, grow well, deliver services over a long time, that actually counts in their favor. That puts a good high factor onto there, so helps them deliver their requirements onto this process. We're just going to be picking, I mean, Natural England have announced their green infrastructure standards last week. They've introduced a national national urban greening factor, which is based very much on some of the models from Europe and the one from London. So this may be familiar with to some of you. And I think I just need to leave people with this. I think one of the things that, you know, Cecil was saying about people's engagement with nature, making sure that people have that connectivity. We know that people intrinsically know what makes them feel better, but they can't, when they're talking to us, always express that in a professional and scientific terms. But just in undertaking the consultation for the City of Nature, a common response from people across all cultures and ages was, we'd just like to see more trees and more flowers in the city. So that's very encouraging for me that there are a lot of people out there who want to see these things. So, and that's me done. So I shall stop sharing and pass back to Alan for any questions, comments.
Splendid.
Thoughts.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon, for a very informative presentation, very stimulating. And yes, we have a few questions. Jasmine was interested in, is there any information or plan for the species that are going to be used and how these have been decided? You covered some of that ground, I think.
Yeah, so I think it's a bit of work in progress. I mean, we're starting an urban forest accelerator program this year in partnership with the National Trust and Woodland Trust and community forest trusts across the UK. Part of which we are going to try and see how we can work up 5-year planting plans. So look to be much more forward looking in terms of understanding where our losses are likely to be occurring, and then exploring with, you know, producers what trees they have coming forward. Because the one thing that I know that we see a lot of is we see the same few tree species coming through, and that's because that's the demand and that's what the producers are producing. But is that actually what we need in 5 or 6 years time? And we know that lead in time is going to be critical to getting the species that we want to be fulfilling the city. So, you know, it could be that, I don't know, I'm not going to say this, but I think one of the London boroughs has started, you know, planting lemon trees out in the streets. I'm not saying Birmingham's going to get to that point just yet, but I mean, that's the sort of development that we're seeing. That would have been unheard of, wouldn't it, you know, 20 years ago. You know, so
yeah.
Alan, sorry, yes. Simon, if you can turn if your Wi-Fi can cope with your camera being on, it would be lovely to see you.
Oh, sorry. Yes, sorry.
Yes.
There we go. Going back on. Sorry.
Oh,
there we are.
Brilliant. Excellent. Just really following up on your question there. Obviously, Birmingham is comprised of very multicultural neighborhoods and what have you. Do you select any species that are specific to those cultures?
We have done a little bit of that. I think, again, that's something that we want to explore more of, and it's part of our community engagement strategy that will be in the, you know, that comes out from the Urban Forest Master Plan. We're looking to how we can bolster the sort of the capacity within some of our community organisations like Birmingham Tree People to engage with those local communities, get more understanding of what, you know, they have affinity with. You know, just from my general experience, you know, I know that a lot of our minority communities are very interested in, you know, productive trees rather than trees for their own sake. So, you know, having things like, you know, fruit trees, nut trees, those types of things are things that they would be more welcoming of. And that's certainly borne out in some work we've just done this year with National Trust on their Blossom Together project. The fruit trees were really, really popular across the board there, and taken up by all walks of community as well. So, yeah. But obviously that then tips the balance a little bit maybe on species diversity, but we have to sort of balance it off elsewhere. So
Yes, well, thinking of female ginkgos, I suppose, in the Chinese community and
yeah,
things like that. Yes. Okay. Yes. Thank you for that. Sue was interested in the fact now that the plan is making progress. Are local communities being more positive and asking for more green space and trees?
They certainly are, yes, and I think this is where we just need. I think this is where we also need to make sure we've got the right. We're passing the right kind of information over, the right education. We're certainly encouraging communities to undertake tree planting on their own. We just need to give them some advice and guidance on the right tree, right place, right reason, all those sorts of things. Where we can support that, the delivery of that, we're doing that. We've potentially got some money coming out of our clean air zone fines into a community pot that can be used for communities to undertake a wide variety of actions within their neighbourhood, but part of that will be, you know, green interventions. And when I've been out in the wards talking to some of those, they've been looking at things like, can we get some hedgerows in, because, you know, when we're walking down this road here, there's all the pollution coming off the road, or we'd like to see some more trees in this bit of park space or this housing space. So they are going down that line. Yes, they are also thinking about the maintenance and the leaves and everything else as well, but it is a balance. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Amelia Smith was interested in how do you deal with the time lag between planting trees and the benefits that obviously come with well-established trees, which obviously is quite a few years, one could argue.
It is, and I think this is, you know, something that we're really trying to stress, and it is, you know, we need to be putting significant effort into retaining our mature trees as long as possible. You know, it's not a case of we start to see defects in trees, we're going to remove them. It's about probably managing that process better over a period. So although, you know, highways is one aspect, I think, which is always a bit tricky with trees, but we try and retain every tree as long as practically possible. We need to be sort of eking out that time frame as much as possible, because like you say, you know, from planting to maturity, it's going to be 35, 40, 50 years. So everything we can do on that front there. So can we improve the quality of the management around those trees that we already have? Can we reduce, for example, the mowing regime so that they're not getting as much compaction on the soils? Can we alleviate the compaction? Can we improve the rooting environments for those trees? Give them a bit more resilience and a bit more chance to fulfill their full life expectancy.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm not sure I should answer this good, but I will. Yes, Daniel Wynne Mackenzie was wondering what teams are responsible for implementing the plan. For example, have you got an in-house landscape team that are expected to include more trees in their design, or are these targets passed on to outsource consultants, or who actually does the work, apart from your good self, of course?
Yeah, I shouldn't say that it feels like it's me for everything, but no, no, there is a good team. I think really it is I suppose dispersed across the council. So we have a couple of us officers who sit in the city's planning teams. So we're obviously working with developers, but we're looking at the overall city's policy and strategy on that. We have our parks tree officers who are managing the trees within most of the council estate. So they are incorporating that into their planting programs and survey programs, trying to ensure that we have best practice management of trees. We also have our highways contract and tree managers there, and we've got an in-house landscape practice group that does some of the work around I suppose development of our own green spaces, and also inputs into the process of designing new green spaces in the city. So they are all very much aware of that. They've all been involved in the development of the Urban Forest Master Plan. So we've tried to engage everybody as early as possible. We still need to, you know, fully engage with some of the other major landowners, so the likes of our Calthorpe Estate and Bourneville Village Trust. But, you know, on the whole, they actually have their pretty good tree management systems of their own. It's just, you know, maybe there's a few bits to pick up on there in terms of getting their tree planting activity up to par, but you know, there we go.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Andrew Burton was interested in how the utility companies are sort of dealing with the extra trees, and are they happy to allow more space for the tree planting?
Yeah, good question. I think for some instances, you know, they have tried to push back on us planting trees, especially in sort of proximity to some of the utilities. And in some cases, we've just ignored that and planted anyway. And I think we just had to do that. But yes, in terms of how we're looking at it from a planning and development point of view, when we're seeing new developments coming forward, we are trying to encourage the use of utilities corridors, ensuring that those are segregated away to create the planting spaces that we need. So trying to avoid that conflict in the first place. It's very difficult to avoid that conflict in, you know, an existing already crowded urban space, but as sites are going forward to the development, we're getting that. So there's a few instances where we do follow their guidance, and that is where we've got sort of, you know, nationally important infrastructure, you know, high pressure oil pipelines and stuff are very sensitive. So yeah, we do keep well away from those.
Yes, I think perhaps just one more question, and perhaps we can keep the rest for the discussion at the end. But Fabrizio was wondering how the plan is financed, and is there a specific green budget in the city at a time when obviously money is not exactly overflowing from local authority coffers?
Yeah, it's a really good question, that, and that's still one that obviously I think, you know, we're going to be battling with for some time to come. I think we have got a number of options there. So, you know, within our highways budgets, we already have a replacement planting budget set aside there. So that covers some element of that renewal. Within new highway schemes and development schemes, we also have a process whereby we look at the financial value of the trees as well. So using CAVAT, the capital asset valuation of amenity trees, and we use that as a measure of how they're impacting the trees, and we also secure some quite good sums from that as well. So where tree replacement isn't quite up to par, we actually secure that money to go into a tree planting budget. Partnership working as well, so with joining up with the likes of the National Trust, Woodland Trust, and of course our own tree warden group, who can help raise funds for this is crucial. Then we've got things like the CAS funding as well, so the Clean Air Zone funding, and as we'll be coming forward, the biodiversity net gain funding. So lots of different streams. I think it's just tapping into those, and I think that's where our sort of that mapping system come in quite well, because we can show that benefits to the health service. So, you know, we've got some engagement going on with the National Health Service, who want to, or the local community health trust, should I say, who want to fund tree planting because they can see how that would benefit their patients. So they're happy to sort of fund some tree planting that way. Lots of multiple different pots, I think, rather than one big pot.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you for answering all those questions. There are quite a lot more in the chat, but I think perhaps we can pick those up later on. Gentrification and all sorts of other things, of course, cropping up as it would. But thank you very much for your presentation and your very robust answers to questions. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
So I think we can move on to our third speaker this afternoon, who is Anne Julo. Anne is an experienced professional urban planner who specializes in green infrastructure and sustainable urban design. And those of you who engage with the excellent TDAG publications on the broad spectrum of urban forestry and its associated issues will recognize Anne as being one of the key contributors to these publications, for which obviously we are very grateful indeed. Anne's presentation concerns developing local tree strategies. And ma'am, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Alan. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Give me 1 minute. And I will go full screen. So I'm going to give you a brief presentation this afternoon to give you some insight on some work that's going on the south coast of England, in Bournemouth, Poole and Christchurch, where the council has initiated the development of a tree and woodland strategy. They are at a much earlier stage than Simon and Birmingham, in the sense that they're still at a stage where they're gathering evidence and doing consultation to develop a strategy. And I'm going to share with you what they've found so far and what has motivated this work. So, sorry if I could, there we go. So why has BCP embarked on the development of a tree and woodland strategy? I think Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, as its name gives away, is a fairly recently created council that brought together some pre-existing local authority. I think that the council was established in 2019 as it currently stands with its existing boundary. And as a result, it's the 10th largest conurbation in England, with just in excess of 400,000 residents. And so one of the big work has been to develop a policy framework that had that geographical focus. And BCP, as I'm going to call it from now, has inherited 3 legacy documents in terms of managing local trees and woodland. One tree management policy that existed in Poole, a tree strategy for Christchurch and East Dorset, and a Bournemouth tree strategy, all of which were relatively out of date in terms of the time frame which they were initially designed for. And so one of the first requests for BCP that they had 3 out of date legacy documents, and that they wanted a comprehensive framework, but also they found themselves on a repeated basis unable to implement any of the tree planting campaigns. There's been some funding available from national central government, as well as some local opportunities associated with sponsorship that the tree team had been approached with. And they reply, well, we can't do any of that because we have no idea where we have some available planting space. There were also what sort of local dissatisfaction within the council, both within the tree team, but also the planning team and the wider sort of green space climate change staff, that there was no clear definition of expectations from new developments. And what the data, and that's what they shared with us when we started to work with them. And the data that analysis we've conducted has shown that there's a lot of tree loss that's happening in the private realm, whilst overall canopy cover in BCP, and they've had the chance of having a consistent approach to measuring canopy cover since 2007 using blue sky data. Whilst overall canopy cover has increased, if you does that breakdown public versus private realm, the public realm has increased canopy cover enough to compensate for severe loss in the private realm, to the point where we've assessed that's the equivalent of 90 professional football pitches worth of canopy cover that have been lost in the private realm, mostly to incremental infill development, it seems. So the house is a little bit burning there in terms of having a coherent policy for managing tree outcomes from new development. They also complained and feel uneasy about having no shared vision among council departments. Maybe the highways budget, not wanting to see any new tree planting taking place for fear of maintenance liability, whilst residents and some councillors want more tree planting, or definitely the green team, or the ecology team wanting to protect heathland, open habitat, and going quite wanting a quite exhaustive definition about what the buffers for those heathland were, and wanting to have tree cutting on those buffers. This going against an increase of the overall canopy cover and how. So there's a range of conflicts and multiple viewpoints that need bringing together so that a coherent approach to tree management, where our tree need is, where our tree is appropriate, and what's our policy that was needed within the council. And the council felt also that it was in a very poor position to bring partners and work with communities. which represents a really strong missed opportunity for the broader stewardship that we all know is needed for a local urban forest to thrive. So that's an overview of some of the motivation that that they had, and the analysis of has added to this in terms of realizing the value of BCP owned trees, which you see here some estimates of using different methodology, using a replacement cost method or looking at amenity value, as well as some of the measurable ecosystem services that were measured using iTree Echo that was applied to the public tree inventory. Trees are probably one of the council's most valuable assets in terms of what's on its asset register. And in BCP, we have an interesting situation because unlike many other conurbations in England, the publicly owned canopy cover represents a vast majority of the local canopy cover. Only 30% of the canopy cover in BCP 31, to be precise, fall in the private realm. And then BCP itself directly owns and manage 56% of the canopy cover, and the rest of the publicly owned canopy cover will be a range of owners, such as the Forestry Commission with publicly accessible woodlands, etc. So the council is a very important player locally, and that's very different to the situation we found, say, in Birmingham, where the weight of council-owned trees is much smaller compared to what we have here. Now, BCP has a comparatively high canopy cover for a coastal town in the UK. It currently has 21% of canopy cover. So it's quite an extensive, diverse, and pervasive asset, as you can see through the green shaded areas on that map. And it really supports all the ambition pursued in BCP's big plan. BCP has this corporate plan that set out its vision, and some of the key elements of this big plan is to deliver iconic cityscapes, and trees, especially trees right on the coast, are one of the iconic elements. It aims to facilitate town center rejuvenation, notably around Poole, which again, trees can be an important component of. It is seeking to create a modern infrastructure where sustainable travel thrives. And there again, especially with the population profile that BCP has, with a very high proportion of over 65, walking and cycling, especially walking, won't happen if surface temperatures crosses over 35 Celsius degrees very often, which they not presently do and will more and more in the future. So that enhancing local ambient temperature at street level is really important. And also there's the aspiration to increase the production of new development. There's very strong housing demand. The population is expected to increase by 20% within the next 15 to 20 years. So that's a very, very big increase. And there's a real challenge in managing to deliver at pace residents and new housing that is of quality. And that quality element is something that trees can, we argue, can really help with. And there's obviously the need to reduce the area's exposure to the risks associated with climate change, which I probably don't need to cover very much with you, but was an argument that we put forward when we spoke to local councillor about how much investing in trees was really allowing them to fulfill the key aspirations that they had for their area. Now, what's interesting is that whilst there's this quite extensive canopy cover resource that exists in the council, not all wards are able to tap into tree benefits in the same way. And just like we've seen in Birmingham and like in many other cities, there's very strong unequal access and inequitable as well, if you look at it in light of other indicators, with some wards having less than 7% canopy covers, and others, and interestingly, the most tree-rich in terms of the areas with the strongest covers are right on the coast, with over 40% canopy cover here in Canford Cliffs, for instance. So the top 5 wards for canopy cover represent 14% of the population and concentrate a quarter of the canopy cover. And that's something that is also correlated with multiple deprivation. As is being done in Birmingham, we are mapping tree equity, looking at access to green space, using the 5-minute distance that Cecil has highlighted in his 300 rules. We're looking at urban heat island. We're looking at the different component of multiple deprivation. What else are we looking at? Age vulnerability due to age, either very concentration of very young population or older population. Now, I don't have yet a draft of that map, but we've calculated a tree equity score for each ward. And so I want to jump on this. Our approach, and I should probably have started there, but in terms of developing a tree and woodland strategy, I'm involved as the lead consultant. I'm working together with Tree Economics, who's been helping with some of the analysis of benefits and the characteristics of the structure of the public tree population, some of which I've showed to you, just a little bit of it. There is, importantly, a cross-departmental working group that's been set up. And I think that's really central for realizing any change associated with enhanced tree management, is to really bring a working group that goes through the council with staff from highways, whether it's highway maintenance or highway capital investment, whether it's to support sustainable travel or safety. We have some heritage and design input, planning, both policy and development management, as well as enforcement. We have some public health representatives, climate change expert, green space, you would expect that, as with arboriculture. And importantly, within the working group, we also have GIS skills and comms skills, as it is sort of really important to try to make the strategy process an early engagement tool. Now, part of the data analysis, we're trying to do it partially in-house. We help develop the methodology. Some very high skill and using specific software is done by Tree Economics. The rest is done by the council itself, but in partnership with us in terms of defining the methodology, data analysis methodology. But we're also, through that, trying to build an in-house capacity to monitor ongoing change and keep the plan that we're developing alive in the future. There's 4 phases of work, which are pretty standard. We're at right now within that sort of orangey bubble in terms of conducting the analysis. We've looked at an analysis of the characteristics and value ecosystem services of the public tree population. We're doing an analysis of canopy cover provision and canopy cover need. And we're also using the criteria of the urban forest sustainability criteria, which Alan has shared with you. We've also amended the lists that exists to make it more specific to the council in order to assess urban forest sustainability in light of criteria related to the tree population itself, in terms of related to the management practices, as well as the sort of community setting and engagement approach related to trees. And the last element of the analysis is on tree outcomes from new developments. This was a priority for the council. And we've worked in partnership with Bournemouth University to take a sample of development that have recently completed in the past 3 years to go back to what was agreed in the planning application, what were the pre-development condition in terms of canopy cover, what was agreed at planning permission stage. The site has been surveyed by the University of Bournemouth student to look at what was delivered. And we're at the moment compiling conclusion from that work. On average, only 60% of the trees that were said to be planting were planted. So there's compliance issues in terms of their species, in terms of just pure provision. The findings are quite interesting. And in parallel to this work, we've tried to work out a consultation program. We felt that for this stage of the work, we were primarily going to engage in terms of meetings within the council partners, in terms of sister agencies, and representatives from community organizations. We didn't have the budget and the time to go out and do full-blown consultation, engaging the local population. And this is something that we're looking at doing at a later stage. I'll come to this in a minute. So we have some stakeholder workshops that have either individuals or organization that represents those different areas of knowledge that are already represented in the working group, but embrace both the public sector and the local non-for-profit, as well as the private sector. For instance, we have representatives of tree nurseries, local green professionals, green space maintenance professional, just to give you an example. We have local non-for-profit championing for sustainable travel locally. Bournemouth Active is very involved. Local NHS Dorset and public hospitals, so landowners, public, private landowners, the Talbot Estate would be one example. So quite a wide range of stakeholders are coming to this workshop. We've had a revisioning workshop in September. We'll have a priorities and solution workshop in March. We've done an online survey, which is our way to get the wider public input with some mapping tool residents are able to use. And the consultant team that I'm leading, we're doing a lot of one-to-one interviews with a range of stakeholders that are participating to the workshop to get more in-depth conversation on key topics. The direction we're taking in terms of some of the recommendation, this is not going to be exhaustive by far, it's just very provisional at the moment. But what we seek to produce is a document that at its core has some key principle for urban forest growth. And we're looking at taking a charter approach where we would have some principles that then the local authority can also use and to engage others so that others can sign up to those principles and develop their own action plan towards. And so that's something that we're key to provide, so that the strategy provides a framework both in terms of delivery for the council, but also for others to contribute to delivery. We're looking at the integration of trees in local planning policy, and we're studying a range of models, the green area ratio or the green factor model, which is recently championed now also by Natural England, but it's been implemented in Greater London and Southampton. Canopy cover targets as they are found in High Wycombe and Cornwall, as well as canopy cover increase target and minimum cover, which is a slightly different model which exists in Colchester City. We're looking at integrating trees and good practices relating to trees into other BCP departments and sister agency policies and specification. For instance, an obvious target is to rewrite or enhance the specification used by BCP highways when they plant trees. Same thing for BCP homes, the social housing provider for BCP council that's directly controlled by the council. Future Places, which is a regeneration agency controlled by BCP that leads to the regeneration of key sites. They're at the moment at the stage where they're developing design codes for a range of very large developments. And we want to make sure trees are included within that. We're looking at, and this is sort of an that's where public engagement would come at a much greater scale, at neighborhood scale tree plans. So on the basis of the tree equity mapping that we've highlighted and the analysis in terms of tree needs, we're able to define which neighborhoods ought to be targeted for investment. And we're recommending the adoption of neighborhood scale tree plans, where first an analysis of tree planting or plantable space can be done, and an engagement with the local population can take place around where to plant trees, where to make enhancement to existing trees, how this can contribute to other objectives in terms of sustainable travel, for example. So we're trying to also work together with community organizations so that once the tree strategy is adopted, there's a framework and a roadmap for launching 1 or 2 neighborhood scale tree plans right straight away with a very robust approach to community engagement. And we're looking at drawing together opportunities for integrated investment projects. And what I mean by this is that the council, even though BCP, like many other councils, has very strong restrictions on its spending, there are still capital investment programs taking place. And there are opportunities within these capital investment programs to better fulfill the objectives that are pursued by the council by integrating trees. And what we're trying to do is highlight those projects that will lead to the greatest return in terms of making the effort to put trees in, or to understand how trees can be better integrated into the project. Voilà. Thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anne, for a very thoughtful and creative presentation. Yes, I'm very jealous, really, because I think quite a lot of towns up here in the north, 7% tree cover, if you're lucky, and you think, yes, it's got some way to go. I was quite interested, though, you say you haven't had great contact at the moment with communities, but you've done online. A lot of the people who are moving in nowadays are not local. They come from all sorts of parts of the country. I was wondering if you found any difference between what local people thought, who sort of grown up in the place and known it since the dot, and people who moved in from somewhere else and thinking, oh no, you know, we can do this, we can change that. And I was wondering if there was, you had come across any difference.
I don't think we've had enough widespread engagement for me to make a judgment on that. What I will say is that we've had a pretty good response rate to our online consultation in terms of what we were hoping to achieve. And that in terms of Bournemouth, Poole and Christchurch, there are probably a lot of people who are not from there in terms of where they've spent their life, because there's a very strong retirement community there. In terms of community engagement, I would argue that in terms for the council, there's a real untapped potential in terms of community engagement and partnership, because it means that there are also people with a fair amount of time on their hands, potentially, to get involved, especially in the development of those neighborhood tree plans. And so the preliminary work that I've conducted, for instance, with local organizations that support the elderly communities, like Prima Life, they were very interested in this initiative, saying, well, I can think of a broad number of our partners and then of our members that would really love to contribute to this. And at the moment, there was in Bournemouth about 10 years ago, for instance, a tree warden group that dismantled. And at the moment, there are no intermediary between the general public and the council on tree issues. So I'll need to come back once neighborhood tree plans are underway to tell you if there's a difference. But I'm quite interested to see, given the population profile locally, whether we can manage to, through this neighborhood level planning exercise, manage to create a grassroots movements there around trees. There are grassroots movements, but
Yes.
their efforts at the moment are not directed towards trees, which is clearly a topic that motivates, given the responses we've gotten, very positive and quite good responses to the online survey.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes. Well, I think, ladies and gentlemen, we've had three very wonderful and special presentations. And I think it was Desmond Tutu a long time ago said the most difficult people to waken up are those who are pretending to be asleep. And I think a lot of our national politicians, local politicians, some professions perhaps, have known about the benefits of urban trees for a long time, but have pretended to be asleep, really. But I think all three presentations have shown us that actually, no, there are significant waking up going on and significant progress. So I think we can have the floor open really for discussions. And if anybody wants to ask questions, have thoughts, comments, then please do. And please turn on your camera and do it in person. I think that would be good to see you. So I pass it over to the floor. Any thoughts or comments, ladies and gentlemen, that you would like to put to either the speakers or indeed to all of us?
Well, I always have a thought or a comment, so I'll start, if that's okay. So I was really interested in the question that Daniel raised about, he says it's in an unnamed country, but he's got policymakers who want to plant young trees. They say that's a much more sustainable solution to retaining mature trees. And this is something that's actually happening. We did it in our Trees in New Development leaflet. We had so many case studies of some misguided understanding that if you plant new trees, you get more carbon sequestration over their lifetime. It's all much more useful, and that's how to do it. And none of that seems intuitive. So in looking at his question, you know, how would we resolve that? Because that, again, sorry, just to pick up, is also what we've got in BS 5837, isn't it, with the categorization system, which can lose maturing trees.
It was like
okay,
over 2 hours to do hedge laying.
Really?
So
sorry, I've silenced everybody because somebody jumped in. So you might want to unmute all of you, including Alan. Sorry about that.
That's better, yes. No, it's interesting the point you make. In fact, talking to Bartram Trees, some of them have been getting very irritated that people have been wanting to plant larger and larger trees. And they say, well, you've lost 20 years off the life of that tree because it's already, so come on, plant a smaller one so the poor thing can actually get a chance to do what it's supposed to do. And we have had some arguments saying, well, no, sometimes you've actually got to plant a big one as a visual, whatever it may be. And, you know, the press are going to be there from day one. So just having a twig isn't very helpful. But
don't take out a well-established mature tree and think that it's going to be much better to plant 10 small ones.
No.
Which is what his question was sort of concerned about.
I think if I could just jump in there, Sue, I think that's one of the things that we've included in our planning policies. Yes, while we've tried to make our planning policy more robust around tree retention on development sites. That's one of the reasons why we also included that financial valuation as well, because it's sort of like, hang on, you know, if we're now saying that actually we can tie that to a Section 106 requirement for, community sums to plant trees, hang on, if we actually retain the mature trees longer. I'm not saying you shouldn't, you know, there isn't a case for losing some and generating an age structure within a population, but it has helped, I think, a little bit. It's, you know, we're in the early days of that process, but yeah.
Actually, while folks are here, can I just say a couple of things? This year, the European Forum of Urban Forestry's conference will be held in Krakow from the 23rd to the 27th of May. And if you're feeling creative, please submit an abstract. They close on the 20th of February, so you haven't got long to do it. And I've put the web address on the chat. As well as that, this year we have the second World Forum on Urban Forestry. First one was held back in 2018, and now we're having the second this year. It will be held in Washington, DC in the States between the 16th to the 20th of October. And also, if you feel stimulated, please wang in an abstract or anything else you want to do, because there are going to be very many events there. Not quite sure it'll be singing and dancing, but I suspect it may well be. But all sorts of presentations, and it doesn't necessarily have to give papers. So again, the web address is in the chat, and please give it some coats of thinking over, because it'd be good to see as many of you there as you can get. It's a bit close to the White House. I'm a bit worried about the quality of the security, but we'll see. That's.
We don't have to sit here till 4 o'clock, because we said it was going to last till 4 o'clock. But there's just one thing here. If there's any wisdom in this virtual room at the moment on the question of commuted sums, because we have a whole session coming up at some point later in the year on tree planting costs. And commuted sums keep coming up as the kind of argument against tree planting. So the word out there is what we really need is national guidance for commuted sums, because the differences can be so great. I mean, we did one study and it was £300 in one area, £3,000 in another. You know, it just, there's no rationale, but it becomes an argument to reject street trees. So is there anybody here who can either say something now about commuted sums that would be helpful, or could email us with anything they've got? That we would really appreciate that. Simon.
No, I was just going to say, I think I noted that I saw on a post that somebody said Adept had done some work on costs for highway tree planting. That's the Association of Directors for Environment, Transport, Planning and Transport, isn't it? I haven't seen it yet. I need to find that
unless it's recent. They did some ages ago.
It was recent. It was, I think they've only just published it again. So yeah, might be worth looking at, because I need to find that as well.
Hi, sorry, if I can ask a question. Nice to meet you all. I'm joining.
Yeah, please do.
From Rome. I'm an urban planner here, and well, thanks for organizing the meeting and also for the speakers to their presentation. I briefly mentioned in the chat before. It's about this topic about green gentrification, because well, I think it's close in relation to all the free speakers, and for the work that she's doing with the local communities, well, for the Cecil Rose that he's been promoting, but also for the urban forestry strategy in Birmingham. How do you deal with that? How do you try to engage with the local communities already at the beginning, in initial phases, or how do you deal with the, let's say, negative effects of green infrastructure in especially minority communities or disadvantaged neighborhood? Thank you.
Yeah, interesting question.
Yeah,
go ahead, Simon. Go ahead.
Go on. No, you go first. That's fine.
No, this is a great question, right? And I think sometimes even taken to the extent that people say, let's not green, because green gentrification is always bad. I want to nuance that a little bit, right? I was actually reading a book recently about, I mean, green gentrification comes in many forms, right? If it means that neighborhoods become more mixed, that there's economic power sometimes moving in, and some of the original people are also there, it could be okay, right? Neighborhoods do transform and they do change. So I think sometimes it becomes a bit too much like, oh, let's not do it. But of course, it's obvious that we have to make sure everybody gets the access and the benefits of green space. There's no doubt about it. And I think, as you said, Giovanni, I think working with communities from the start, and I think there's some really good guidance documents now on how to manage green gentrification and be aware of it and make sure you don't make it worse than needed. I think that is probably a way forward. But I said I'm a little bit more and more actually starting to think that, you know, it's almost like we should not do any greening because it's going to change neighborhoods. Well, I don't agree with that, to be honest.
Yeah, we've had that question about gentrification through urban greening as well, and I think somebody else actually pointed out that some of our areas are so deprived it's going to take an awful lot to gentrify them. So we've we've got a long way to go before they actually start to come up. In terms of community engagement, I think that we've got a number of strands. So we've got 101 elected members in the city, so they're our councillors, so they have regular ward forums, so we've got communication channels out through them to their communities. We've got the likes of our Birmingham Tree People, which are our tree warden group, which are, you know, act as eyes and ears on the ground. They're part of our consultation process as well. There are 130 Friends of Parks groups across the city, so there's lots and lots of different community groups, and we've definitely seen a big increase in those over the COVID pandemic, whether that be particularly around urban green space or just about, you know, improving their local area. That could be through litter picking groups. And then we're looking at forming a sort of a green champions network as well, so we can sort of pass on and cross-pollinate those different groups with different aspects. So we've got people who are particularly championing the green aspects of energy saving, but we've also got those that are doing around urban greening, litter picking, physical activity in the green space. So trying to coordinate that through a citywide approach is sort of starting to pay some dividends, I think. But it's a massive task with, you know, like 1 million people. We just can't ask everybody. I think our diverse population is an aspect that we need to try and tackle a bit more. It is difficult to get into some of those hard to reach communities, but I think also we've got quite a good diversity amongst our councillors and other community leaders who can help us get into those community groups a bit easier. So yeah, it's finding the right people, I suppose. It takes time, it takes effort, takes some understanding of what it is that sort of they want to engage with. I'm sure, you know, Alan, I know you mentioned it earlier about, you know, picking up on particular sort of cultural aspects and relationships to trees and colours and all sorts of things. You know, what can we do to try and engage those communities better, or tag in that starts that conversation?
Yeah, certainly in Leeds, we've done quite a few schemes that are reversible. So whether it's in the community or whether it's highways or whatever it may be, you just say, well, let's close this road for a week and see what happens, and get some very large trees in containers and just do a little group of them in one cut. It's not overly designed, and see what happens. And it's amazing how quite often, I've forgotten how many streets now we've actually pedestrianized, and that highways have said, well, actually, no, it wasn't a problem after all. We thought this had happened, but no, it didn't. So yeah, all right, carry on and do it. Being able to reverse things. I mean, I must admit, I even have to admit it. We even used artificial grass sometimes and just put that down in the street and put seats in there and just see what happens, really. And you know, after school was full of kids and mothers are there and what have you. And it slowly you can then say, well, shall we do a more sort of formal job then? Yeah, that will be wonderful. So it wasn't a plan that we came along and said, look, this is what's going to happen. It wasn't imposed. It was put down as, you know, designers look at it and think, flipping heck, that looks awful. You say, well, at the moment, it's not a final design. It's just to see how people can react to it. And it's been quite successful in many ways.
But that raises whole issues about design, you know, and I mean, sometimes if people are happy using things and enjoying them, you know, do you need to do too much more? Because they might actually, if you really go in and design it like they've done in parts of Oxford, you might not want to use it, or it gets used for the purposes that weren't ever intended anyway. So
Yes, yes. Well, I think sometimes possibly we over-design. I do think you can tell a scheme that's been done by landscape architects because it looks if it's been funded by Findus frozen peas, because they're just lines of little green circles all over the place, and you think, yeah, right place possibly, but it doesn't apply to everywhere. I'm probably biased, so I shouldn't say it. Yeah, turn the recording off.
Can you hear me? Oh, that's
Yeah.
good. First of all, I'll clear up. It says Anne, but my name's Andy, not Anne. I'm using my wife's PC because my one's a Steam driven, and this is a newer version of a PC. I know Sue James because I used to meet her in London at TDAG regularly. There was talk about utilities, and I worked for Thames for 40 odd years, and used to attend, if you probably know, you may not know, that local councils under new roads and street works have to have a quarterly coordination meeting, and they can be very useful to make those contacts with the right people, and if you've got any plans, bring them forward and find out what utilities are doing and see if there's any options to get on the back of something. So I did most of London and it worked quite well. And I fed back information from the TDAG meetings to the other utilities that I used to meet. So I just thought I'd throw that in, if that's okay. And it's very nice to see everybody. Enjoyed it very much.
Yeah,
enjoyed it very much.
cool.
Thanks for joining. I thought you looked familiar, but Anne was confusing me.
Yeah, well, it
Doesn't like
confused,
say
it
anything.
confused
You don't like say
me.
anything these
Only at
days.
weekends. Only at weekends.
I was going to say yes.
Okay.
No, I think it's interesting really how short memories we have, because I used to work in the new town and all the housing areas had a common service trench. It was 2 meters wide and you knew where it was and you could plant trees wherever else you wanted to. You talk to housing folks now about it and they say, oh, you can't. I say, well, yeah, you can. And we've had a few successes. One of which was, have you got to put a big gas main in? Well, yes. Right, well, put it right the way through the middle of the housing area. What? Why? Oh, because you can't build on it and you'll have a little green space, won't we? We won't be able to plant it with trees, but that's where the kids' play area is going to be. That's where we can do this, that, and the other. And everybody's going to be a lot happier than having the whole, oh, all right. And utilities were quite happy to do it because they knew where it was, and if they needed to dig it up, it wasn't that difficult. But it makes a big difference to the housing area to have that sort of size gap right the way through a housing. So there are ways and means, I think, of doing these things. But I think the other thing is going to be interesting is the biodiversity net gain, which I think is going to come in November, if I'm not wrong, for all developments, and that's going to be an interesting one. In fact, we're already discussing it. But,
on that note, shall we start to wrap up, Alan?
I think that's probably a good idea, yes. Well, and may I thank you speakers on behalf of everybody who has attended today for 3 amazing contributions. They're absolutely superb. So thank you very much indeed for your time and for telling us what you're doing and what's carrying on. It's been very knowledgeable and I think everybody has moved on. So thank you very much indeed. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending. As you all know, the TDAG seminars are worth their weight in gold. So hopefully we'll see you at the next one. So meanwhile, thank you very much. Take care and hope all is well in your neck of the woods.
Thanks, everybody. Okay.
Bye-bye.